Hi everyone, I hope you're doing well on this Friday. Just for those keeping track, for those watching the video, my cowlick is still there, and it is intact. So if you want to keep a running tally, there's only going to be a few more videos, but I will make sure it's there. And I may ask you an extra credit question at some point, and that way I'll know if you've been watching these videos. Anyway, I want to say a little bit more about Arendt's essay. There was about a 10-page reading for today, pages 69 to 81. I have the book here in front of me. Um, Arendt is continuing her reflections on civil disobedience, um, and in particular, today she's going to give you more of a positive definition of what she sees as the phenomenon of civil disobedience, and she wants to be sure that she's going, out of her way not only to distinguish civil disobedience from conscientious objection, but to distinguish civil disobedience from general criminal disobedience, because the conflation of civil disobedience with criminal disobedience is in some ways I mean, it's just worse, and it's ignorant. Whereas the conflation with conscientious objection is understandable and perhaps unavoidable given the moral justification of the civil disobedient. And so she's going to say something about how civil and criminal disobedience are different, um, and also how and more clearly, what does she see as civil disobedience? And in particular, I'm going to be referring to something on page 74 where she really clearly lays out what civil disobedience is. Um, but I want to say something else about, before getting specifically to today's reading, I just want to say one other thing about what she says between uh, civil disobedience and conscientious objection. Um, Arendt is not dismissing the relevance of morality for civil disobedience. She's not saying that morality is irrelevant, but that ultimately the meaning of civil disobedience as a political action, which is to say something that is engaged in by a group of individuals, and something that is um, attempting to remedy an injustice in the world. Um, that is what makes civil disobedience the thing that it is. Whereas conscientious objection, if you look, and she really is here looking to the texts of Thoreau, especially, um, who Thoreau, it's not that Thoreau didn't think that there was injustice in the world. And indeed, the claim about the injustice in the world is based upon a moral claim, that he is making a moral claim about what is wrong with the world. And through his act of disobedience, he is registering that moral claim about the injustice that he sees in the world. But yet, Thoreau does not demand or insist that the injustice be remedied through some kind of larger group-oriented action. As Thoreau sees it, men, citizens, have no obligation to work to make the world a better place. Only that they are correct in their thinking, and that they personally know that they have done the right thing. Um, but whether the injustice itself is remedied as a result of what Thoreau did is not his larger concern. And that is Arendt's worry about somebody like Thoreau. It's, again, just to say, it's not that morality is irrelevant to civil disobedience. Indeed, the very thing that civil disobedience is responding to is injustice in the world, but ultimately, the action itself relies upon, um, I guess the point is, in order to remedy the injustice, it requires a public confrontation, a confrontation with public opinion, in order to try to remedy the injustice. And political action for Arendt is fundamentally public by its very nature, engaged in by a group of individuals themselves. And so the ultimate, and so this is going to get tied into today's reading, that the justification for civil disobedience, while it may be responding to a moral problem in the world, its justification lies in the group nature of the action, the power that arises between people when they act together. That is its political nature. And also, Arendt is going to ground civil disobedience in a kind of constitutional justification, not necessarily a moral one. So anyways, it's just important. I'm going to post a link to a reading today that kind of clarifies some of this. But it's not that morality is irrelevant. It's just that civil disobedience is not reducible to moral claims and moral justifications. And that is the key point. Now, anyways, I want to sort of pivot then to today's reading. So, Arendt is reflecting upon the time period in which she's writing this. And she's talking about just how much the legitimacy of the U.S. government at the time was being called into question by the citizens because of actions by, in particular, the Nixon administration regarding things like Watergate, the Vietnam War. She goes on to list a number of episodes that are going on. So jumping ahead a little bit on page 74, she writes, instances are numerous, and she's referring to when the government is about to engage in some kind of illegal or unconstitutional action. And she just lists a number of them here. 7 years of an undeclared war in Vietnam, the growing influence of secret agencies on public affairs, open or thinly veiled threats to liberties guaranteed under the First Amendment, attempts to deprive the Senate of its constitutional powers, followed by the president's invasion of Cambodia in open disregard for the Constitution, which explicitly requires constitutional approval for the beginning of a war. So anyways, Arendt is just here in this chapter reflecting upon how turbulent the times were in the late 1960s and early 1970s because of U.S. foreign policy and also in terms of U.S. domestic policy. And so it was not an accident that there was a rise in political protest during this time period because the time period demanded and called for it. And so civil disobedience, and this is why, given the time period, given the circumstances, and given the large amount of protest that people were seeing daily on their television screens, it became easy to lose sight of what those who were engaged in civil disobedience were doing. It became very easy to simply conflate civil disobedience with criminal disobedience because so many people were engaged in a kind of activity that it became very easy, and it became very easy for the administration, indeed the Nixon administration, to simply dismiss protesters as simply criminals or traitors who were not upholding allegiance to their government or something like that. And that is the point, is that civil disobedience, they are certainly not traitors or treasonous to their government. Indeed, this is the crucial point. The civil disobedient actually thinks that the government has a legitimacy, institutions have a legitimacy, and that is what they are fighting for. They are fighting to restore the legitimacy of the government, but they are claiming that under current circumstances, the government and its institutions are acting in illegitimate ways, and they are saying there is a legitimacy, there is a standard to which we can hold the government, and we are attempting through our actions to change the unjust laws or force the administration, whether it's the Nixon administration during the time or whenever it's happening, to change course so that it is legitimate again. So that's a key, is that it could be very easy to look at protesters, those who are engaged in law breaking, and simply say that they are treasonous or traitors. And that's a very kind of quick, dismissive, rhetorical move on the part of those in power, especially the president, to simply dismiss protesters as treasonous or engaged in, reckless behavior, when those who are engaged in the protest would say, no, actually, you're the one who's engaged in the reckless and the illegitimate behavior, and we are trying to remedy. We are trying to make the public aware and to remedy the injustices we see. So that's a crucial distinction to make. Whereas the criminal disobedient, the difference between the civil and the criminal disobedient, well, it just seems kind of obvious. Those who simply engage in criminal disobedience, well, they don't, they're just breaking the law for the sake of breaking the law. They're not trying to call attention to any kind of injustice in the world. They are breaking the law for their own personal benefit so that they don't get caught. Whereas civil disobedience, obviously, is a public display of disobedience. Literally, the act itself is the breaking of the law. It is saying, look at us, look at what we're doing. We are breaking this unjust law. We want you to see us. And therefore, the whole point is to get caught, is to show that you are breaking the law. Whereas the criminal disobedient, the whole point of breaking the law is to not get caught. It is to try to avoid the public eye. So the conflation, there's kind of an obvious difference between the criminal and the civil disobedience just at that level, in the very way that they are breaking the law and the very reasons they are breaking the law. That conflation might be easy, but once you examine it a little bit, it's obvious how quickly it falls apart. Now, going back and looking a little bit at 73 and 74, she says here on 73, the second full paragraph, she says, since disobedience and defiance of authority are such a general mark of our time, it is tempting to view civil disobedience as a mere special case of law breaking. From the jurist's point of view, the law is violated by the civil no less than the criminal disobedient, and it is understandable that people, especially if they happen to be lawyers, should suspect that civil disobedience, precisely because it is exerted in public, is at the root of the criminal variety, all evidence and arguments to the contrary withstanding. So again, she's not going to deny that there are some similarities between criminal and civil disobedience. And indeed, she goes on to say that those engaged in protest and those engaged in protest against the law may be attractive to the criminal disobedience. Criminals may try to, kind of come along and co-opt the movement for their own purposes. And so it may become hard to distinguish between those who are engaged in the protest and who are legitimately engaged in civil disobedience to change the law and improve the law, and those who have simply kind of co-opted a movement, come along and joined the movement simply for their own purposes, to break the law, to simply kind of make a bunch of noise. So this would be the difference between the civil disobedient and the anarchist. The anarchist who is, a group that basically says things like, we need to abolish the police, which is different than the civil disobedient. The civil disobedient retains a respect for the legitimacy of certain institutions, whereas the anarchist um, is similar to what Sartwell says. The anarchist does not maintain that same respect and hope for the legitimacy of institutions. Um, Now, again, it's not to say that the civil disobedient, in the moment they're engaged in the act, they don't regard um, the present, instantiation of these institutions as legitimate. It's precisely because they have engaged in actions that seem illegitimate, that the civil disobedient feels the need to restore or change the laws back to the standard of legitimacy that is there in the first place. Whereas the anarchist, the criminal disobedient, and I don't want to conflate anarchists and criminals, but the anarchist would say there's no legitimacy in the first place. There's no legitimacy to be recognized. So the civil disobedient would disagree there. There is a legitimacy to be recognized. And the legitimacy for the civil disobedient, according to Arendt, can be found in the Constitution. Um, the Constitution provides us with the kind of legitimacy that the civil disobedient needs, whereas the criminal or the anarchist would never recognize such legitimacy in the first place. And then, one further, group. So we've got the conscientious objector that Arendt is concerned gets conflated with civil disobedience. We've got the criminal lawbreaker, which gets conflated with civil disobedience. We've got the anarchist, which is another one I'm introducing now, and then we've got the revolutionary, who is trying to change the form of government. And she talks about the revolutionary in today's reading as well. I forget specifically what page it's on, but so actually, if you go to the bottom of 76, she writes, hence, the second generally accepted necessary characteristic of civil disobedience is nonviolence. And it follows that civil disobedience is not revolution. The civil disobedient accepts, while the revolutionary rejects, the frame of established authority and the general legitimacy of the system of laws. The second distinction between the revolutionary and the civil disobedient, so plausible at first glance, turns to be more difficult to sustain than the distinction between civil disobedient and criminal, right? So again, you can look more at that on your own, but it's not going to be always easy to make the distinction between the civil disobedient and the revolutionary, as it is between the civil disobedient and the criminal, because the revolutionary also wants to change the world, similar to the way that the civil disobedient wants to change the world. But accepting the legitimacy of certain institutions and systems is going to be, again, the difference between the civil disobedient and the revolutionary. Okay. So, anyways, I want to then look specifically at what Arendt says on 74. This is going to be some crucial lines that really give Arendt's. She's going to say this is what civil disobedience is. Civil disobedience arises, so I'm reading here from 74, when a significant number of citizens has become convinced either that the normal channels of change no longer function and grievances will not be heard or acted upon, or that, on the contrary, the government is about to change and has embarked upon and persists in modes of action whose legality and constitutionality are open to grave doubt. So she's pretty specific here that civil disobedience arises in response to questions of constitutional legitimacy. That civil disobedience takes its grounding from and in response to specific constitutional violations. And again, it's not going to be as always easy to figure out specifically whose claims about which constitutional laws are right, but Arendt is clear that that it has to do with the legitimacy of the government and the legitimacy of the government as it is enshrined in the Constitution. And that's where Arendt's justification for civil disobedience comes in, is that she, in later chapters, Arendt, I think it's in the reading for Monday, Arendt will talk about, and she gets this distinction from a French thinker, in the 18th century named Montesquieu between the spirit of a law and the letter of a law, or the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. And Arendt thinks that there is a kind of spirit to the U.S. Constitution that is contained in the kind of larger revolutionary spirit that was there at the founding. Arendt has a whole other book titled On Revolution if you're more interested in this. So, but Arendt is giving us a kind of constitutional justification for civil disobedience rather than merely a moral one. That the justification for the civil disobedient is that they are attempting to say the government has violated its legitimacy according to not only the letter of the Constitution, but the spirit of the Constitution. And that gives us, at least Arendt thinks, a better purchase upon how we can justify the civil disobedient act rather than merely a moral one. So those are some crucial lines. Now, something else Arendt is going to say on the next page about civil disobedience is that she's going to talk about how the civil disobedient is based upon so if you read at the bottom of 76 here, she says, the point at any rate is that we are dealing here with organized minorities that are too important, not merely in numbers, but in quality of opinion to be safely disregarded. So again, this is why she's saying we can't just dismiss the civil disobedient as we can't just dismiss the civil disobedient as just another group of criminals, because when she italicizes there quality of opinion. Now, what is she saying there? So for Arendt in other writings, Arendt will talk about the fact that politics is ultimately rooted in opinion, not truth. Now there's a lot to say there, but she calls it quality of opinion. So those who have engaged in civil disobedience have public opinion on their side, and the way that they've done that is they've managed to think from the perspective of others. They haven't merely formed a private opinion about the world, but that it is a quality opinion in the sense that their opinion is rooted in seeing the world from others' perspectives, inhabiting the place of somebody else in the world as well. And so, in other words, the very formation of the way that I see the world is informed by the way that you and you see the world. And so I don't see the world from my private perspective because that isn't politics. Seeing the world from my private perspective is not rooted in what Arendt calls plurality, which goes back to something I talked about on Wednesday. Seeing the world from another's perspective, it has to be rooted in plurality, which is to say, when I think about how I see the world, I also need to think about how you see the world. And how I see the world is fundamentally tied up with how you see the world because we share the world together. And so that is the kind of existential condition of politics that I talked about on Wednesday. And Arendt is saying that civil disobedience is grounded in that kind of quality opinion. That is not only how my private perspective sees the world, but how us as a group have attempted to understand how everyone sees the world. And that is what we're trying to put out there in public. So that's a crucial distinction between just opinions and quality opinion. So I actually think that's as far as I want to go today. I'm going to have some more to say next week about how Arendt responds to the problem of tacit consent in Locke. But I hope some of this made sense. Again, some big takeaways here, understanding how civil disobedience is different from criminal disobedience and how it's different from anarchism and how it's different from the revolutionary. That all comes out in today's reading, and you're going to want to be familiar with that going forward for some quizzes. And indeed, also understanding Arendt's constitutional justification. I'll say more about that next week, but thinking about how she's grounding civil disobedience in the Constitution rather than in some kind of higher moral claim. And how that constitutional justification might allow us to get around and avoid some of the problems involved in grounding it in morality only. And indeed, some of the paper prompts that I've asked you to think about in relation to Arendt talk about how her constitutional justification might get us around some of the problems involved in the moral justification. Anyways, that's all I have for today. I will see you next week, and I hope you have a good weekend.